Hi everybody, my name's Arzan Tarapore. I am a research scholar here at Stanford University at a place called the Center for International Security and Cooperation. So I study international security, and specifically I study international security in Asia, and I focus mostly on India. Now, when we talk about international relations or international security, if you open the newspaper or read the news, you will see a lot of talk about wars that are happening in the world. You'll these days hear a lot about things like tariffs. If you hear about countries, you might hear about countries like Russia or China. But I focus on a country that doesn't appear that much in everyday talk about international politics, and that country is India. What I want to specifically talk to you about today is that despite the fact that we don't hear that much about India on a daily basis, it matters a great deal for the United States. And I want to explain why India matters so much for the United States, for American policy in Asia and around the world. American relations with India have had their ups and downs. During the Cold War, there was a long history of tension and friendliness and tension and friendliness. And after the Cold War, just when things started to seem to be improving, India tested nuclear weapons in 1998. And again, the relationship had another series of ups and downs. But the really interesting thing is that in the past 2 or 3 decades, the relationship has just gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And this has been the case regardless of who the president has been in the United States. And it's been the case mostly regardless of what's happened in the relationship. That no matter when these two countries get frustrated with each other or have differences of opinion, they can quite remarkably look past it and keep developing the relationship to get deeper and deeper. So this is a really interesting and pretty rare case where the US has tried to deepen a relationship with a country, a major country, India, despite not always seeing eye to eye with it, and done so very steadily and very consistently, and in fact, quite sharply, quite quickly. So why is that? I think that the US in the 21st century sees many reasons to work very closely with India. And I want to focus on 4 of those reasons in particular. And the first reason, the most basic reason, is people, right? I live here in Silicon Valley in California, where there are a lot of Indian immigrants. And in fact, the size of the Indian immigrant population in the United States is very large. And not only is it large, but it's also very economically successful, educationally successful. So when you see a lot of the leadership of many of the countries of the United States' most lucrative, biggest companies, especially in the tech sector, you'll see Indians in charge of many of those companies. So the people-to-people links, which have really flourished in the past few decades, are extremely important. Lots of Indian people come to the United States for education and for work, contribute enormously to the American economy and society. And I think that bridge, that people-to-people bridge, is extremely important. So that's the first reason. The second big reason is geography. If you look at a map of where India sits in Asia and in the world, you'll see that it sits right at the top of the Indian Ocean. And why is that important? Because the Indian Ocean carries so much of the world economy's most important traffic. So when all the factories in China or Japan or Korea make stuff, they need energy. And they get energy for making that stuff. Those factories get their energy from the Middle East. And when they make that stuff and ship it back to Europe, they have to go again through the Indian Ocean. And so the Indian Ocean has become this really, really vital artery of the global economy. And India sits right next to those really important shipping lanes, where a lot of the world's energy flows go, where a lot of the world's trade goes. So not only is that an important part of the world, but it's a part of the world that's going to get more and more contested. The Chinese military is growing, and China also wants to influence what happens in the Indian Ocean. And so what we're going to see in the next few years is an increasing presence by the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean. Now, the United States recognizes this. The US gets that the Indian Ocean is extremely important and that India is the most powerful country in the Indian Ocean. And so that geographic element is a really important reason why India matters to the United States. The third reason is diplomacy. It's important for big countries to maintain good relations with as many other countries as they can. And as big and powerful and influential as the US has traditionally been, frankly, there are some parts of the world where the US just has not been paying sufficient attention, right? In those parts of the world, however, India has had historical connections and good diplomatic relations. So I'm thinking here mostly of some countries in Asia and lots of parts of Africa, for example. And in those parts of the world, what some people you might hear referring to as the global south, India has a lot of continuing influence, diplomatic connections. And the US lacks those diplomatic connections in those parts of the world. And so it really makes sense for the US to be on good terms with India, to maybe coordinate policies so that what the US wants to do around the world, it can get Indian help to coordinate that diplomatic messaging around the world. And the final reason, this is going to sound a little bit obvious, but it's actually a really important reason, is just India's size. India is the world's most populous country. It is a country with the biggest population in the world, bigger than China. It is the country with the world's second biggest military in the world. And it is the country with the fifth biggest economy in the world, right? So this is a country that you cannot ignore. The US has, as I said at the beginning, over the last few decades, had times where it's been closer and further apart from India, but it has recognized that you cannot ignore such a big country, especially if, as the US sees itself, if you are locked in a competition over who has the most influence in the world, and the US is competing with China for that, then you cannot ignore such a big and influential country like India. So those are the four reasons, I think, that are driving a lot of why in the past 20, 25 years, the US has so consistently tried to build relations with India. Now the question is, okay, if the US has these reasons for building relations with India, what does the relationship look like and where does it go from here? Over the last couple of decades, a lot of the relationship has been driven by military cooperation. And this is because the two countries see eye to eye on many strategic issues, right? Beginning most importantly with China, but over the last couple of decades, a lot of issues that have been important to both countries have been reasons for the two countries to work closely together. So for example, soon after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, we saw India as being a natural partner in combating terrorism around the world. And that's been overtaken in the past decade or two by this concern over China, the growth of China, and the increasingly assertive policies of China. And so the US and India see themselves as having common interests in maintaining security in Asia. So military cooperation has been a big part of the relationship. Increasingly though, in the past maybe 5 years or so, we've seen the US and India try to develop an even more durable relationship. They've tried to really integrate their systems of technology, research and development, systems of industrial production. And if the two countries can tie these types of systems more closely together, then the relationship is not going to vary very much, because we'll see our future as being connected to each other, right? And so this is much of the calculus, that the US and India can integrate these systems, especially around technology and industry. And the third big part of the way the relationship is going is essentially how they see the international order. The two countries, as I said, have a lot of common interests, and when they see themselves as agreeing on the rules of the road, or what they might call, for example, a free and open Indo-Pacific, and they see countries like China challenging those ideas, the US and India see themselves as natural partners in trying to shore up or reinforce an international order that works for them and for the region. Let me conclude with what I see as a couple of the challenges for the relationship going forward. And the first, most important one is that India is still a developing country, right? We see lots of news stories of really high-tech, really impressive, glitzy stuff happening in India, but for most Indians, it is a developing country. So it is a country with not a lot of resources to devote to things like maintaining international order or military cooperation with the US. So we'll continue to confront India's capacity limitations in how much it can devote to things that matter to the US. The second key issue for India is that historically most of its threats have come from the north, from its land borders with Pakistan and China. And so if your threats are continually coming from those areas, you're going to focus very rationally on making sure that those areas are secure. And that means you're going to have less ability to project influence into the Indian Ocean, right? Which is the area, if you remember, that matters the most for the US. And so India has many problems, which are all very intense problems for India, and it has to figure out how to prioritize and balance them for its own national interests. And that sometimes is not always what the US wants to see. And the third problem is that, look, as someone who studies India, I spend my time educating American audiences about India, about the fact that it has resource constraints and difficult priorities. But frankly, over the last few months, we've had to realize that some of these problems may not be problems that come from the Indian side, but from the US side, right? We now have a United States that has decided to completely change how it engages with the world. And you may agree with that, you may not agree with that, but the fact of the matter, the indisputable fact of the matter that everyone agrees with, is that it's completely different. And it's now completely unpredictable. And when things are so different and so unpredictable, for better or worse, it makes it very hard to forge a meaningful and dependable relationship with other countries. So these are the types of challenges that both Washington and New Delhi are going to have to deal with as they continue. And I think, you know, there will be difficulties as they try to grapple with these problems. But if the last couple of decades are any indication, I think both countries see it in their interests to keep developing this relationship and keep working towards this relationship, which they both see as being critical to building their national power.